Hello, everyone. Thank you for your participation today. My name is Jay Bowden. I'm an Environmental Due Diligence Compliance Officer at U.S. Bank. I serve on the EBA Board of Governors, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Before we get started, there are a couple of formalities to get through. First, today's webinar will be recorded. Afterwards, the recording and the presentation slide deck will be posted to the EBA library, available to the EBA membership via our website at www.envirobank.org. If you're not a member, then please consider requesting a membership package to learn more about the benefits of joining our organization. Second, EBA makes no representations or warranties about the accuracy or suitability of information provided in the webinars. Related materials are not intended to constitute advice of any kind or the rendering of consulting or other professional services. The opinions expressed in the webinar are those of the speakers only and may not necessarily represent the views of the EBA. We anticipate the duration for today's webinar will be around 45 minutes. Afterwards, we should have another 15 minutes for open Q&A. During the presentation, the attendees' lines will be universally muted, though all attendees who are connected via a computer are free to submit questions at any time during the presentation by writing in the question or chat space, which should be viewable along the right-hand side of your screens. During the Q&A session, all computer lines will be unmuted and attendees can verbalize their questions at that time. Attendees that are connected via a landline or a cell phone can submit questions via the EBA website, and those will be answered later. Okay, so much for the formalities. It truly is my pleasure to introduce two of my favorite people in our industry. Sean Leary and David View are presenting to us today from Vieau Associates headquarters in Minneapolis. Sean is an Executive Vice President and Due Diligence Group Manager and holds degrees in Environmental Science and Biology. David is the company president and is a licensed professional geologist and certified hazardous materials manager. Both Sean and David are program instructors of the ASTM Environmental Site Assessment Standards and collectively have 50 years experience in our industry. Today's webinar is titled The De Minimis Paradox. The presentation will compare and contrast recognized environmental conditions and de minimis conditions, some obvious, some not so obvious, and delve into the gray area between them. The goal of the presentation is to educate lenders and consultants alike as to some regulatory nuances and risks that may be associated with de minimis characterizations in the Phase 1 site assessment reports that we all work with every day. Sean and David, gentlemen, thank you for being here today. Please tell us, how can something so trivial be so complicated?
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Jay. We appreciate the opportunity to speak in front of you all. We've got a good group of attendees. Look like everyone's logging in right now, and we're busting over that 200 mark. So really thank you for everyone for joining us today. We're going to assume that everyone who's tuning in for this webinar is familiar with E1527, the Phase 1 standard, and CERCLA, Superfund liability. So we're going to be using these terms as we go through it. We're just going to get started here. And again, hold your questions to the end. The objectives of this webinar really are to help users, banks, buyers, owners, understand how de minimis conditions are defined, what's in the standards, what's in the regulations that we can look to for guidance, helping producers recognize factors that are critical for the appropriate interpretation of a de minimis condition and how we discuss these in the findings and opinion sections of our Phase 1 reports, and understand the relevant limitations of the Phase 1 standard. And all of this is in the objective. Our objective is for everyone to have the goal of gaining consensus over what is the proper application of a de minimis condition, which we believe can help all of us, users, producers, reduce risk. And in this presentation, you're going to see DMC as an abbreviation for de minimis condition commonly. This is a lot of words. It's a big disclaimer. Jay has gotten through pretty much all of it. He indicated that their views and opinions here are kind of the presenters only, and that's what this is basically telling you. But we've got a little something else here to let you know that even certain elements of this presentation may not even represent our own views. We've designed a presentation that is going to be back and forth, and we're going to demonstrate how the different interpretations of the standards, and we may be absurd or facetious or contrary at times in our statements, and that's not necessarily endorsement of any of these particular interpretations of the standard. It's to make a point, and so let's get started.
Okay, hi, Dave View here, letting Sean kind of take the lead on this. But the first thing we want to do is visit a few key definitions that bear directly on our use of de minimis conditions. Out of E1527, everyone's familiar with recognized environmental conditions. It means really the presence or likely presence of a hazardous substance or petroleum products on, in, or at a property due to a known release to the environment or under conditions indicative of a release, a suspected release basically, or under conditions that we believe pose a material threat of release to the environment. Within this definition, it is stated that de minimis conditions are not recognized environmental conditions. So we see here, though, that de minimis conditions are integral to the definition of recognized environmental conditions. That's going to be important. If you turn the corner of a building and see this, I think everyone would agree that there's a reason to believe there's a contamination problem here. And this is actually a pretty easy illustration of what we might all call a recognized environmental condition. Now let's look at the definition of CERCLA release, CERCLA being Superfund. It uses a lot of words to convey spills, leaks, disposals of hazardous substances or pollutants or contaminants. I'd like to just point out how the CERCLA definition of release is a little more expansive than the definition of recognized environmental condition, in that we're specifically identifying pollutants or contaminants. Key to the definition of a release, and I know this is sort of rudimentary, and I'd like to direct everybody to the legal appendix of the Phase 1 standard, E1527. If you want to do a deep dive, that legal appendix has a very good discussion of these key terms and definitions. But again, I want to come back to the environment as it is defined. Generally, what we think of as navigable waters, the surface waters, the groundwater of the United States. One of the key issues here when we talk about a release to the environment is releases that are wholly contained within buildings or structures. And generally, those kinds of releases are excluded from the Superfund definition of a release. You've all walked in industrial properties and seen spills and stains, and nobody gets too worried about it because they're so common, and we don't think of them as evidence of a Superfund release.
And there are other exclusions to note here when it comes to Superfund releases. So we have exclusions for releases that occur solely within a workplace, things like emissions from engine exhaust, releases of nuclear material. Normal application of fertilizer. We have the petroleum exclusion people are familiar with. Note that, the Phase 1 standard were to identify releases of hazardous substance and petroleum products, but for the purposes of the Superfund law, there is this petroleum exclusion. And then we have cost recovery exclusions as well. Cost recovery is the notion that the EPA or another third party can take cleanup measures and then seek recovery of those costs from potentially responsible parties using the Superfund law. So you have cost recoveries for naturally occurring contaminants or substances, building materials, applications of pesticides, and permitted release.
Those would be like wastewater discharges, air emissions discharges, where there's certainly hazardous substances being released to the environment, but you can't recover costs for cleanup of those impacts.
Exactly. So a de minimis condition doesn't present a threat to human health and the environment and wouldn't likely be subject to enforcement action. and is not a recognized environmental condition.
So again, what we're looking at is this is how ASTM E1527 is defining the de minimis condition. And again, I point out it is integral and incorporates the term recognized environmental condition within that definition. So there's really two criteria there. We'll come back to that criteria. And even though the standard uses terms like generally would not, think of it in terms of a de minimis condition is not a threat to human health and would not be subject of enforcement action. So here's a illustration, something that we've extracted out of the ASTM Phase 1 course. I'd like to point out I've been teaching the Phase 1 standard since 1994. The concept of de minimis condition has not changed since 1994. I've had an opportunity, it's really a unique opportunity to share thoughts and observations with a wide variety, many thousands, literally thousands of environmental professionals, aspiring environmental professionals, users, and regulatory agencies, including the federal and state regulators across the United States. We flash up this picture, and just about everyone can agree this is probably the intent of what we're talking about when we call something a de minimis condition. It's common. Everybody has experienced this type of situation. So, but you know, for environmental professionals, zooming in their attention to transformers, we might see this kind of staining. It looks like a small quantity of material.
Yeah.
If this is a transformer that's post-1980 installation, this leak is not likely to contain PCBs, and again would be easily categorized as a de minimis condition.
Yeah. So you know, with a newer transformer, chances are we're dealing with a mineral oil, and this would be a very common de minimis condition potentially for an environmental professional to identify. But what we want to do here is point out and challenge the notion that de minimis necessarily means small quantity. These are an example of some more transformers here. And they're privately owned transformers at an industrial property. This here is the only observable leak spill to the environment.
Everyone remembers what Snoopy said about eating the yellow snow.
Not a good idea in this situation, for sure. And it looks like a small quantity. This would have been a big mistake for EP to identify as a de minimis condition because it ended up representing the six-figure cleanup at this site. And so not all small releases are necessarily de minimis conditions. When we look at E1527, the Phase 1 standard versus the all-appropriate inquiry rule, how do they treat these things? The Phase 1 standard, E1527, requires us to identify the de minimis condition in the finding section. And therefore, there's an internal requirement to provide an opinion on the impact of the de minimis condition on the property. All-appropriate inquiry does it differently.
Yeah, the all-appropriate inquiry rule explicitly does not require the identification in the report of how the EPA puts it, quantities or amounts of contaminants that would not pose a threat to human health or the environment. You can certainly see the parallel. The all-appropriate inquiry rule does not formally recognize the term de minimis condition, but it does talk about very small, extremely small quantities. We note these two differences in how to treat, say, small quantities, small releases. The significance is that an environmental professional that does not identify a small release would fail to conform with E1527, but does not necessarily fail to conform with the all-appropriate inquiry for the purposes of landowner liability protections, which of course is why users hire us to do Phase 1 environmental assessments.
And this is sort of the paradox, that one of the paradoxes that we wanted to point out here with the de minimis condition is how the Phase 1 standard and the all-appropriate inquiry do things differently. So one question is, if you want to avoid documenting de minimis conditions.
Yeah, just don't require an E1527 compliant assessment. I've often challenged the students in our course to try to do a phase 1 environmental assessment without referring to E1527. If you just go to the all appropriate inquiry rule, you'll find that it's not easy to be confident that you are conforming with all appropriate inquiries in the writing of a report. E1527 helps us immensely because of its more prescriptive nature.
Now, taking that same concept, doing an all appropriate inquiry phase 1, what we see here, this could be not discussed in the report completely because of the petroleum, the requirement not to address petroleum.
Assuming these tanks are petroleum tanks.
Assuming these are petroleum tanks, exactly. Another professional might want to call this a de minimis condition because they believe that there's only been a small quantity released. That might be a risky position to take.
In Minnesota, our reporting threshold is 5 gallons. So up here in the Twin Cities, this would obviously turn into a recognized environmental condition. But if we go down to Texas, that might be a different story. I'm not exactly sure how big of a stain you'd create with, 4 10-gallon buckets tipped over, but it might be comparable to this.
I think what we really want to point out here with this slide is that you can have even a substantial petroleum concern, and with AAI not need to address it, and also the differences in geographies of how, even that first slide that we showed with the stain under the parking lot, when Dave's taught classes in the past, he's had regulators disagree with him that was a de minimis condition even at times.
This was very recent, just this year up in the state of Maine, when I flashed that picture and said, this is a typical de minimis condition. I really got called to the table by several regulators. That's a very actionable stain.
So it's a matter of an opinion, and it changes when you cross state lines. So you got to know your territory that you're consulting in, or you may be kind of out of school on these things. So what about other qualifying criteria for de minimis conditions?
As opposed to quantities, right?
Yeah, as opposed to quantities. We look at quantity as a guide, right? But we pointed out how it's not perfect. Sometimes these small releases shouldn't be de minimis conditions. One thing we look to when we're identifying this is, would the cleanup cost likely be lower than the cost to investigate? There's a fairly good argument there that maybe in this situation, you have a de minimis condition if you're going to spend more money investigating the issue than it would be to clean it up in the first place. Another situation would be where you have impacts from a closed release that meet unrestricted land use criteria, and you've qualified them as an HREC. Well, the impacts could also be called a de minimis condition.
Everybody understands historical recognized environmental condition. That definition was changed substantially, and therefore you still can have remaining contamination, but there's no restrictions to land use. So another form of impact or contamination is what we refer to often as DAP, diffuse anthropogenic pollution. This is the kind of contamination that is really all around us. I can find this kind of contamination in your front yard. It comes from air emissions fallout. It comes from stormwater discharges. It comes from the day-to-day activity in any urban environment. And yet we know it's there. It generally is not subject to any kind of action. It's not considered a release of a hazardous substance. The question really becomes, is it a potential problem? Does it rise to the level of, say, a threat to human health? There are also the impacts that are clearly exempt from CERCLA's definition of a release, that being the remaining impacts from fertilizer applications or, basically pesticide applications, even though they're considered a release of a hazardous substance, to the extent that they're not subject to cost recovery provisions, also seems to imply that they're really not a Superfund risk to a user.
And these last two we've bolded them because I think there's significant sort of disagreement in the consulting and even I think on the user's end too of whether 4 and 5 really should be good criteria for a de minimis condition, whether CERCLA's definition of a release is important, given that petroleum, again, wouldn't even be included at all, and whether cost recovery is important. But I think these are factors to consider.
I'd like to point out one other, it should be probably a number 6 up there, but what about observable impacts versus non-observable impacts? In other words, we can see staining, we can see spills oftentimes, but we don't necessarily see impacts from fertilizer or pesticide applications. It's just a question I throw out in terms of qualifying criteria. If a condition is not observable, does it qualify as a de minimis condition?
We're going to get into examples at the end and some back and forth that I think will help you all understand this. And are we talking about business environmental risks here too? This is how some consultants choose to handle these in their report. They're maybe have some trepidation of calling something a de minimis condition. They want to identify it in the conclusions of the report, calling it a business environmental risk. So getting back to this normal application of fertilizer, this is a good example of a very common de minimis condition you'll see in reports. The property is used for agricultural use in the past. There was normal applications of fertilizers. You may find elevated nitrogen or phosphorus, whatever, in the soil from these fertilizer applications. Well, they don't meet the definition of a release. Many times they don't pose a threat to human health and environment, are unlikely to be subject to enforcement actions for many uses. So yeah, very common, and I would argue pretty good use of the term de minimis condition.
What about nitrates in groundwater in the state of Iowa?
Can take things too far at times, right? and whether those nitrates have come from a normal application or from some sort of a bulk storage of fertilizer, where you've had, here we have some staining around some fertilizer tanks. They also have areas where they have done wash down of the equipment and spread the fertilizer. So this is all we can observe as the staining potentially. If we call the staining a de minimis condition and move on around the tanks, are we missing the fact that the staining is all we can observe, getting back to what Dave was talking about, but what we can observe might be more significant. There may be a release. Maybe it has impacted groundwater. And at that point, our conversations with the Department of Agriculture here make it clear that these are the risks for cleanup from an ag chemical standpoint, the bulk storage facilities. And so, take things too far. So here we see the same compounds in one instance, very appropriate, likely appropriate way to identify de minimis condition, and maybe taking it a little far with the fertilizer tanks, depending on what's known.
And then there's this question of, can a de minimis condition be something other than a release? We understand kind of what a release is. It's when you've got spillage out of a container. We have seen that the de minimis condition in the standard does not specify release of a contaminant. It only refers to a condition. So we've seen in reports a wide array of interpretations of what constitutes a de minimis condition. For example, someone identifies an adjoining property as a small quantity generator of hazardous waste, and there are no reported releases associated with this. Does that adjoining hazardous waste generator constitute a de minimis condition? What about the uses or occupants that have no connection to the use of chemicals? We have seen, the use of the property for office purposes as a de minimis condition in reports. Or the fact that many occupants may be using chemicals, but there's no observed evidence of releases. Would we call those as de minimis conditions? So really our premise is, based on our experience, and also based on a paper that was published some years ago down in a Journal of Engineering in Florida that was authored by Nick Albergo, a lot of you may know, made a good case that the de minimis condition should be based on a release or at least the presence of a contaminant. To the extent that the de minimis conditions and recognized environmental conditions are linked by their Phase 1 standard definitions, they all involve a release. Of course, REC, CREC, controlled recognized environmental conditions, and historical recognized environmental conditions all involve a reportable release. If we look at the all-appropriate inquiry rule, there's a synonymous link to this concept of release. It goes on to say that because of said quantities and amounts of contaminants, that these contaminants generally would not pose a threat to human health or the environment, and therefore do not require identification in the report. And I would also point out in the preamble to the all-appropriate inquiry rule, they refer to extremely small quantities or amounts of contaminants. All of these little factors and references tell me that the de minimis condition should be based on the release or at least the presence of a contaminant. And then we have the corollary. So if we recall the two criteria of the de minimis condition, that it is not likely a threat to human health and the environment, would not be subject to enforcement action if called to the attention of the appropriate governmental agency, let's reverse that. If a release fails any of the two criteria, then the question is must it be a REC? Must the observed condition be a recognized environmental condition? The corollary, if I kind of use this corollary, if the impacts on a property meet the two criteria of de minimis condition, but have not been addressed to the satisfaction of the agency, in other words, it doesn't qualify as a controlled recognized environmental condition, do those observed impacts qualify as a de minimis condition?
You can see here that, for one, yes, probably, right? But what if the observed impact is not a hazardous substance or petroleum product, excluded from the definition of a release from cost recovery, aid chemicals, DAP? And for two, you can see that many groundwater plumes and Superfund sites pose this issue for commercial properties within the area of the groundwater plume. So you've got a big release, and we have experience seeing how remaining impacts from large delisted Superfund sites are qualified as a de minimis condition. May not be appropriate, but we see it.
Well, historically, I've seen the remaining contamination on Superfund sites that have been delisted put into the category of de minimis condition precisely to keep them out of the category of recognized environmental condition. For example, if a lender has a policy that they cannot borrow money if there's a recognized environmental condition, we take the conditions of the recognized environmental condition, in other words, the threat to human health and the subject to enforcement action, and we can take a situation where there's high levels of contamination, but it's received a no action level, or a delisted Superfund site, and say it qualifies as a de minimis condition. This is how the corollary might work.
I think that's more of a historical, the way things were done more in the past before the controlled recognized environmental condition was created.
Exactly. In 2013, with the revision of E1527 and the introduction of the controlled recognized environmental condition, we don't need to do that anymore. We don't need to pluck it out of the recognized environmental condition category if we can call it a controlled REC, and therefore that just helps a deal get done, even when there is clearly remaining contamination on a property.
And I think clearly many EPs are recognizing an evolution that's occurred over the last decade of, especially when writing a report for a lender, the lender is the environmental risk manager. And the consultant need not try to find a way to get the recognized environmental condition to be a de minimis condition by playing with the terms and the arts of the standard. Clearly, Superfund sites are really not meant to be de minimis conditions. But historically, we're pointing out that things have changed along this line. There's been revisions in the standards, and that's why we're highlighting this here. The corollary doesn't work all the time, but it is a useful starting point in the analysis. Key factors are the enforcement and future land use.
So let's look at this element of subject to enforcement action. Does it matter who enforcement is directed to? I talked about the property situated over a very well-known groundwater contamination plume. The user is going to buy this property. They're clearly not an identified potentially responsible party. The known potentially responsible party is identified and cooperating with the regulatory agency in the conduct of response actions. It might be groundwater pump and treat. So if we all agree that the user is unlikely to become a potentially responsible party and the deep groundwater contamination poses no restrictions to land use on the property, there's no wells or other obvious receptors on the property, could we, can we call that contamination a de minimis condition?
Well, but the release is open still, and it remains subject to enforcement action. And so our interpretation is that, no, we cannot.
We have to call it a REC.
We have to call it a REC.
Can't call it a CREC.
It doesn't matter who the enforcement is directed towards, as long as that enforcement exists, we should be calling it a recognized environmental condition. And this is another area that it's not, again, historically this has changed, and this is something that more and more I think people in our industry are recognizing, that de minimis conditions are somewhat dangerous to identify when you're dealing with large Superfund release scenarios. And some of the reasons for this are kind of seem obvious, but what is a de minimis condition today could become a REC tomorrow. They could change the land use at this property. They could put a well down and start using that groundwater. The potentially responsible party could stop cooperating with the regulators, and they could seek new responsible parties. And so this open release, to call it a de minimis condition, really sets somebody else, sets you up in the future for not a good position. And E1527 just does not have this requirement to consider future land use changes.
It comes close. If you look at section 6.8, there's the reason for performing says the user should tell the environmental professional why they're doing the phase 1 environmental assessment. For example, I'm buying this property and I'm going to redevelop it. This is a significant factor. If we're buying a piece of property with what we would call de minimis conditions, measurable contamination, but it's not a threat to human health or the environment, would not be not subject to current enforcement actions. If they come in and change land use, disturb the contaminated soil, all of a sudden that soil becomes a regulated waste, and the user becomes associated with a release, a new release. So the post-phase 1 changes in land use are critical to landowner liability protections. If the user is going to go back to the report and say, but the environmental professional said this was a de minimis condition, not a recognized environmental condition, why am I in trouble today? So that is really how you, in concluding that something is a de minimis condition without any consideration for the intended land use, the user can end up falling into this liability exposure trap. So, the question really becomes: should the environmental professional address how the threat to human health varies with land use? And I would argue it's very important, even though there is not an explicit requirement for the environmental professional to consider future land use in the conclusion of a phase 1 report.
If you change from a commercial use to a residential use, you're going to have new action levels, and what is maybe a de minimis condition at the commercial property might become a recognized environmental condition at the residential property.
Or daycare center property, something that we see remarkably often.
And in the future, you might also have changes in regulatory action levels. We're dealing with this all over the country with chlorinated VOCs and other compounds where we're seeing more strict action levels, whether it's in vapor or groundwater. And we have to kind of think about these things when we think de minimis. I don't know how many people are willing to identify a de minimis trichloroethylene release right now, for instance. Not a lot of people probably willing to do that.
And I would argue that, yes, there may be a concern for an environmental professional to call something de minimis because they know from experience regulations change. And yet, within the context of E1527, section 4.5.4, it's in the principles, basically says that we are not to be held to the new standards. So if a standard for action level on a given contaminant changes in the future, that should not affect our liability exposure as professionals, say, to a conclusion in an earlier phase 1 report.
But you can see how EPs that are identifying de minimis conditions really are playing with fire. This is a dynamic environment. Things are changing. Uses could change. Action levels could change. You're dealing with potentially a limited set of information to draw your conclusions for. De minimis conditions are useful, much like fire is useful. You can build a fire to keep yourself warm. You can cook your food with fire. Fire has many uses, but it can be very destructive as well.
But I do know, too, that our client base, the users out there, buyers, lenders, do not want their environmental professionals to be overly conservative just to play it safe.
Certainly, fire has many good uses, too. And every now and again, you got to burn back the brush. So we're not saying that this shouldn't be a tool in your toolkit, but just recognize that you may be playing with fire when you're identifying de minimis conditions because your professional judgment and your experience can only go so far.
There are the geographic differences, not only in regulations. There's the local good commercial and customary practice, and even the physical setting. A small spill in a highly sensitive karst type of geologic environment is much different than a small spill in a clay till environment.
And so we're going to go through some examples now to talk about all of these things, why it may be dangerous, but go back and forth and have a little bit of a spirited debate between Dave and I on a few de minimis conditions, or not.
Or not.
And this enforcement action, again, we're going to come back and what is meant to enforcement action, okay? So this is an issue that's becoming increasingly problematic here in Minnesota, other places around the country. What they're finding is that the use of this calochlor, a mercury-based pesticide prior to 1994, has led to an accumulation of mostly mercury in soil that have contaminated the upper couple of feet and the greens in the tee boxes and a few inches in the fairways. And these mercury concentrations often do exceed residential values. Now, most of these courses would not use in Minnesota, we wouldn't use a residential value for these courses, but it does present a condition where we have a release on the one hand, in the sense that we have a presence of a contaminant. One could argue that this isn't a release that's subject to cost recovery because we're talking about a pesticide here. So I think there's a very good argument, and I would postulate here, that all of this mercury contamination at this property could very well be put in the de minimis condition category because for the current use of the property, there's unlikely to be a threat to human health. No one's eating the dirt in general here. Ingestion, dermal contact be the only ways you could be exposed, and that's not happening. We're not above commercial.
Wear your golf shoes.
Wear your golf shoes. And also that we have, until we have a change in land use, we're not likely to have any threat of enforcement actions.
But the fact of the matter is, a lot of these golf courses are being acquired by developers and redeveloped specifically for residential neighborhoods. Now, all of a sudden, the mercury in the soil is there. The soil is regraded. It's put into the front yards, and there's a lot of dirt being removed. If you push around this mercury-contaminated dirt and pile it all up, you probably have hundreds, maybe thousands of tons. All of a sudden, it's a waste. It's a regulated waste. It might be a hazardous waste. If it's dumped into the front yards and there's an allegation that now children and residential occupancy is being exposed to high levels of mercury, what do you have? I mean, that's a real serious problem. It's a real serious cost if a developer purchases this golf course with the intent of redeveloping it for residential property and does not factor in this because they were misled, or they'll allege they were misled, thinking this is a de minimis condition, not an actionable recognized environmental condition. There's a problem here.
Highlights the change in use and how so commonly EPs aren't really told what's happening, and we are in the dark. So at a site like this, I think you definitely have to understand what the use is going to be going forward before you could even come close to making a call. Here's an example of an in-ground hoist.
And what do we know about in-ground hoists? They've got small process flow-through tanks with hydraulic fluid. They're unregulated tanks, so obviously the regulatory agency doesn't think they're worth bothering with in a sense. We also know the mechanism of in-ground hoists is that they all leak. They're designed to leak. There's going to be measurable hydraulic oil in the soil around these structures here. So if you've got a single in-ground hoist, the question becomes, do we postulate that the likely presence of hydraulic oil in the soil constitutes a wreck, or does it constitute a de minimis condition? Even if it's pre-1979 and there's a risk of PCBs, hazardous substances, I might say for current land use, nobody's touching it, it's not going anywhere, it's not hurting anyone. This is a good example of a de minimis condition.
And it may be even one where we can look at it and say, the cost to investigate this one hoist exceeds the cost to clean up the hydraulic spill around the hoist. It may be that situation where you could use the criteria to look at the cost of cleanup versus the cost of investigation, and think about what you're finding, what you're likely to find in connection with this single hoist. Now, the second example, we've got our repair shop. We've got a dozen hoists. And it's a little newer. We've got a shallow groundwater table. This changes things. Do we really think that we can call a dozen hoists a de minimis condition? These are over 20 years old.
For current land use, I wouldn't be too concerned about this.
But then again, once you got groundwater contamination, you're going to have enforcement actions. You may be, depending on the state you're in, putting in wells and doing quarterly sampling for years for something like this. So it might depend on your geography, it might depend on a few things, but as opposed to the first hoist example here, once you've got more hoists, if you've got a shallow groundwater table, things are going to get more complicated. It's going to be harder to present a well-supported opinion that you absolutely have a de minimis condition.
Here's another situation that is kind of emerging, at least up here in Minnesota. Constructed stormwater ponds. They are accumulating sediment, and that sediment needs to be regularly excavated now. Usually the cities are in charge of that. What we're finding is the sediment in these stormwater ponds is sometimes very highly contaminated, primarily with polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons. These low volatile fractions of hydrocarbons that originate from parking lots and roads and coal tar-based seal coats. Just on its own, those sediments really arguably don't pose a threat to human health. They're not subject to enforcement action. But when this sediment is excavated either for maintenance or the land is redeveloped and this pond is reconfigured, that sediment becomes a regulated waste. How is the environmental professional supposed to deal with what is well known now to be contaminated sediment, for the purposes of a phase 1 conclusion? Do we put it in de minimis category? Do we call it a recognized environmental condition?
And the complexity here is that, some of the cities now are stopping their maintenance on it because disposal costs are 4 times higher than they usually are. So just consider that all the time this contaminant loading is occurring, and at some point it's going to have to be dealt with.
Yeah. Just a couple more quick examples, the common examples that we see. We have a filling station. It may have had a release in the past. It may be closed. It qualifies as a historical recognized environmental condition. But the remaining impacts, can we put them in the de minimis condition category, since they actually did originate from a release of a petroleum product?
Yeah, and I think that the clear answer there is yes, because if we have an HREC, we're saying that there's not a threat to human health and the environment, and it's not likely to be subject to enforcement. The regulators already ruled on it, and that they meet unrestricted land use. So clearly, this is a de minimis condition that might not even need qualification, further qualification based on the land use.
What about the obvious staining around the dispenser pumps? We know there's going to be measurable contamination in the soil from petroleum products. Can we just dismiss this staining as a de minimis condition, since it hardly pays to clean it up when the following day you're going to come back and start creating the same problem again? Yeah,
and you might have a station that's in full compliance and only a year old, and everything looks great except for a few customers have been really sloppy and spilled, a half gallon at a time, and it's messy looking. And so probably a pretty good de minimis condition if that's all that's going on, but you have to put it in greater context.
So
how about just the impacts of the station altogether? I think this is where some consultants really get it wrong. They postulate that it's just petroleum, and there's maybe a fund out there to pay for the cleanup, and so therefore there really isn't really risky enforcement. And at the gas station, it's just a gas station, and there's no wells or anything else. Well, we just know that that's taking things too far. We don't believe that it was the intent of the standard to dismiss such risks, and so. The answer to 3 in our mind is absolutely not. Shows how a consultant can go too far, but all 3 of those, we were talking about petroleum contamination at a gas station. And in some instances it was appropriate, in others absolutely not.
Okay, and a final example here would be a large industrial facility, just ongoing, industrial operations, the involvement of a lot of chemicals. There's air emissions. There's wastewater discharges. There's a lot of regulated activity on this site. We know there are going to be impacts, measurable impacts, and yet, just like the gas station around the pumps there, it hardly makes sense to try to constantly be cleaning things up even as the impacts continue to accumulate. How can we, as environmental professionals, appropriately characterize the environmental condition of this property? If we conclude these releases are all recognized environmental conditions, I guess the question is, wouldn't there be an inference that response actions are warranted? There must be a threat to human health. There must be something subject to enforcement action.
And this would be a site where you may want to say a lot of the things that are akin to de minimis, that maybe there's not likely a threat to enforcement action based on the permits that show that they've been in compliance. Maybe there's not a human health risk at the property right now, but to go so far as to call a widespread impact at a large industrial facility a de minimis condition, I think is a bridge too far.
Well, in my experience too, what's going to happen is the regulators are going to show up on a regular basis for inspections. They probably would not agree with that characterization.
I don't think they would, and they're in charge in the end. And also, the permitted exposure levels at any given point can change. And so this is you're giving an opinion in a dynamic environment, and the cost ramifications could be very large. So the key here is in the opinion. The opinion provides this basis for concluding a REC or de minimis condition.
And in my view, at least, in expressing the opinion, that opinion needs to be qualified for land use. This condition, this staining, qualifies as a de minimis condition for current land use. But if land use changes, all bets are off. At least the environmental conditions should be reevaluated. There is also this notion that the stain that we observe during a phase 1 reconnaissance is characterized as a de minimis condition in a report that goes out a week later. But the activity that caused the stain is just something that is ongoing. And really at some point, when does that condition cross the threshold and become a recognized environmental condition? So I think the opinion needs to address this particular issue whenever you deem it applicable.
So we're going to try to wrap up quick so we can do some questions here. So we're going to give you takeaways from our presentation. Takeaways are that de minimis conditions are releases with impacts. We're not talking about the office use of the property. We're talking about a measurable or the presence of a contaminant in the environment. And as we've pointed out with the transformers, that not all small releases are de minimis conditions. You have a significant cleanup on a transformer, and not all de minimis conditions are small. There was a decent argument there for that mercury contamination being a de minimis condition.
I would just argue that geographic factors do bear on enforcement and therefore bear on what qualifies as a de minimis condition, and that future land use is a real crucial factor in the opinion.
As we saw with the hoist, cost of cleanup can be a basis for an opinion. And regardless, EPs are playing with fire when they do de minimis conditions. So whether you're right or wrong, you realize you're playing with fire when you're doing de minimis conditions.
I think to get through this, the lenders just need to be confident that they know the consultants that they're working with, and that the consultants understand their levels of risk tolerance so that they can speak with each other and characterize these things appropriately for the purpose of the lender. It really goes to this last point here. It's kind of a question. Lenders, can you live with a de minimis condition for the duration of the loan? The staining around the pumps at a gas station, for example. It's just something for you to factor in. So,
thank you all. We had a few questions come in here while we were going. And the first question had to do with talking about the PCBs around the transformers, and why wouldn't that release be a de minimis condition? Does it have to do with the age of the transformer and not the amount? Certainly the age of that transformer was critical, because those transformers, those private transformers, had PCB oil in them. PCBs were banned in 1979, and older oils can still show up with this PCB oil. So it was a significant cleanup. If it was mineral oil and spilled on the ground, it wouldn't have been a significant cleanup. It was over $100,000 cleanup. Clearly not a de minimis condition. Clearly a release to the environment of a hazardous substance.
Well, in that photo too, I just point out that there was a data gap. There was this snow obscuring, which might have been a much more large, obvious stain on the rooftop there where those transformers were mounted. And that's the topic of a whole another webinar, really, is dealing with data gaps and de minimis conditions and recognized environmental conditions.
Another question, should a phase 1 include discussion as to why something is de minimis? For example, less than defined small quantity, cost to investigate? Absolutely. This is exactly what we're saying, is that these opinions need to be supported. Again, the ASTM standard requires an opinion on the impact of the de minimis condition.
What is the opinion based on? You take it from there, and you can provide a basis for your opinion for determining a REC or a de minimis condition.
We had another question, the golf course example. What if the golf course was used as flood containment? Would it still be a de minimis condition?
Well, ultimately, if you have impacted sediment, it'd be kind of the same thing. left alone, undisturbed, arguably it's just a condition, but it's not necessarily released. When it's disturbed, it is a release. It kind of depends, I think. I'm not exactly sure I understand the question, but is the presence of this contaminant in response to a release, diffuse anthropogenic pollution? There's probably more than one way to skin a cat here. But
is it likely to be subject to enforcement action or be a threat to human health and the environment if the mercury is getting in the floodwater and going downstream to something that's sensitive? Maybe you've got a recognized environmental condition. Devil's always in the details here. And so I think that example, the mercury contamination example, it was sort of meant to show that there's a good argument to be made here that a widespread impact could be a de minimis condition if nothing's changing. But Dave View, in his counterpoint, demonstrated how through a change in land use, there could be a significant cost ramification in the future when all of this contaminated soil needs to be dealt with.
If the question here is whether the mercury can all of a sudden go downstream and impact other people and create a threat to human health, I think you've got a problem. I think it would be, they'd come back to this report calling this mercury a de minimis condition and raise a lot of eyebrows.
That's right. Another question here, is it relevant to classify a de minimis condition as a business environmental risk as well? Makes sense to me. There's some overlap here, but really not appropriate in our mind. In general, business environmental risks shouldn't be releases of hazardous substances or petroleum products.
Business environmental risk, there's a general consensus growing that it is not within the scope of the phase 1 assessment. In other words, if you've got something that's a business environmental risk, it's something other than a release of hazardous substances or petroleum products. But there's nothing, I don't know that there's a real clear consensus. I'm reluctant to go into the area of business environmental risk because it's just so far reaching. I like to restrict my efforts within the scope of the phase 1 assessment as much as possible. That's really opened up the discussion, and I think a lot of these are great points to make. If you want to influence how we deal with these in the context of the phase 1 assessment, you should probably get involved with Committee E50 on environmental assessment within the ASTM organization.
Any other questions? That's what we've got submitted via the chat. Several questions coming in. I just got a note here. Can we speak to de minimis conditions as they relate to soil vapor impacts? Yeah, this is a really interesting topic here. Especially, we just had a conference in Minnesota where we had Amy Hadieris, who is the head of the VIX department here, pointing out how Minnesota's reporting law is outdated such that it doesn't even have any statutory requirement to report a vapor impact, regardless of whether it's high enough to warrant installation of a vapor mitigation system or what we're going for here is a de minimis condition. So I think there are instances where, yes, vapor impacts can be identified as a de minimis condition. We know as consultants that we can't really do VOC vapor testing virtually anywhere without having some detectable amounts of VOCs. Whether you want to call those a de minimis condition or not, I think is a different thing in the context of your report. But I think there's a pretty good argument oftentimes that these low-level vapor impacts that are beneath any regulatory threshold for mitigation could be appropriately called a de minimis condition.
Do we have enough time for more Q&A? We'll take as much time as you give us.
I think we'll keep going as long as we keep getting good questions.
There's a question concerning how our agricultural chemicals normally applied, say, on an orchard, would they qualify as a de minimis condition? And I think one could argue, yes, elevated arsenic in an apple orchard could represent a de minimis condition for current land use, that is unoccupied, used as an orchard. But if you're going to redevelop that orchard for residential purposes, that elevated arsenic is likely to be above acceptable residential standards, and it will have to be dealt with. And if you deal with it without involving a regulatory agency, you'll probably be found to be associated with a new release of arsenic.
And if the question really is just on application of pesticides, well, we wanted to provide a background to show that there's a cost recovery exclusion for pesticides, so it makes it a little bit more nuanced. But otherwise, there is really no difference whether it came from a pesticide or a solvent. Another question. I've seen EPs as a routine way of always classifying railroad right-of-ways as RECs, others always as de minimis. Can we discuss?
Well,
how much time you got?
Yeah. What do you know? It's certainly reasonable to assume that there's measurable contaminants along the railroad right-of-way, from herbicide applications to minor spills to railroad oil and grease, polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons. It's all there. We don't see the regulators taking any concerted effort to clean these railroad corridors up. So I think I'm inclined to lean towards those impacts as de minimis conditions, unless and until that impacted soil is actually disturbed and or land use changes significantly.
And many times that'll be a well-supported opinion. Going back to our presentation, the key considerations are, one, again, where are you? What location are you in? What state are you in? How do the regulators deal with it? And two, in that location, do you have a physical setting such that maybe these impacts are not simply just low-level soil contamination? For instance, in Wisconsin, got history at a lot of sites, pH is showing up in groundwaters. Their PAL in groundwater is very restrictive there for pHs. And so we're putting in groundwater monitoring wells, monitoring what many consultants would consider de minimis conditions. And so it depends, I guess, is the answer.
How do we
let's see. Yeah, I think that might be our last question.
Did we miss any over? I thought maybe we missed one. I'm not sure.
Looks like we got them. So if there's any more questions, go ahead and send them over. Otherwise, I guess we're going to wrap it up. We really appreciate everyone's time here today, and hope you've gotten a lot out of this. And our contact is on this last slide. If you have any follow-up questions from our presentation, let us know. And we do have one last question, so let's entertain it.
PFAS.
Is a PFAS impact at a site with no soil standard a de minimis condition? Well, this is where you need to go back and look at the CERCLA language and look at Superfund and make the distinction that just because PFAS is not yet identified as a hazardous substance in the Superfund law, there is still a mechanism for the EPA to come in and force cleanup at the site because of if they deem that contaminant causes an imminent health risk. So
there's no explicit exclusion of including any contaminants or pollutants within the category of de minimis condition. So I would argue that PFAS is a relevant issue, both from a de minimis condition standpoint and perhaps even a release standpoint at this point in time. But I don't know if you agree with the release part.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's evolving.
Okay. Sean, David, thank you so much. I think we're going to have to draw the line here, but just really excellent information, great presentation. And thank you to everybody that hung out for overtime here. But at this time, we'll conclude the webinar.
Thank you again.
Thank you.